think probably one of the biggest things that went right for Republicans was encouraging people to vote early. So when I looked at the tea leaves from early voting, I saw higher turnout compared to 2020 in heavily Republican congressional districts, like the 14th district, for instance. So Republicans did a really good job of getting their folks to turn out early. And that certainly gave them wiggle room to amass or to keep a lead or to amass a lead, whatever it was, into election day. I think Democrats did as good a job as one could expect. I mean, we're talking about Donald Trump being able to win decisively, and that's true, but we're looking at about a 2.5 point margin, and we're looking at a difference at this point of fewer than 120,000 votes. So 2020 notwithstanding, that's the smallest margin that a Democrat or that a Republican presidential candidate has had in Georgia in this decade, in this century. So, Hillary Clinton lost by 5 percentage points. The fact that Kamala Harris is losing by less than 2.5 percentage points, I think suggests that Georgia is more competitive, but the fundamentals of the state still do privilege Republicans. We always suspected, based on survey data, that there were more Republicans than Democrats in the state. And so it becomes a question of messaging. And so if people were not buying the Democrats' message, then you could do all the mobilization in the world, but it's not necessarily going to help you win. What's different this time is that in 2020, Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by a margin of less than 12,000 votes. Right now, as of this morning, Donald Trump is ahead of Kamala Harris by a margin of less than 120,000 votes. That's only about 2.5 percentage points. Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump by 5 points in 2016. And so what I think that this suggests is that Georgia is still a competitive state. This was a state that would have been too close to call by the margins of the surveys that we were using. We would have had to have survey sample sizes that were much, much larger in order to be able to detect this type of lead as a statistically significant lead for Donald Trump. And so I don't think that that changes the narrative of Georgia being competitive. What I've told people before and what I will say here is that Georgia isn't blue, it's light pink with shades of lavender. And so I think that that actually is still borne out by the data. There's still work to be done for Democrats to continue to recruit people to their party and to their ranks and to their cause. They're going to have to do that with persuasion, and then they're going to have to match it up with a strong mobilization campaign, which they really did try to put together here. And I think that they largely succeeded in doing. There just aren't enough Democrats in the state to have gotten Harris over the top. There had been rumors about Kamala Harris's management acumen. People looked at the high turnover rate in her office during her first 2 years as vice president. The management of this campaign and how she was able to execute something in a short period of time, I think actually is a testament to her organization skills. And she may be able to use that as a platform to be a significant person and a significant player within Democratic Party politics going forward. Doesn't necessarily mean that she is the hands-on favorite for the 2028 nomination. I suspect that there are other people who are going to try to put their hand in the race to try to run. However, what this suggests is she's now got some organizational experience that she'll probably, if she chooses to run, be a formidable opponent in 2028, as opposed to how she ran in 2019, which was, by all accounts, a pretty lackluster campaign. And I think the big question, especially for those who voted on questions of democracy, was, are you going to be concerned by this government? And I think the million-dollar question is, how is Donald Trump going to govern? So since he's been president before, we have an inkling of what his governance will look like. But I think some of the comments that some Republicans took as idle threats and just empty rhetoric are things that Democrats took seriously. And so I think we're going to be looking at whether or not Donald Trump expands executive power, whether or not he tries to leverage the broad immunity that the Supreme Court has granted him to do things that people are uncomfortable with. And I think most importantly, whether or not he seeks some type of retribution. The Democrats weren't going to be able to ride the post-Roe wave, solely to a victory. I think one of the things that we're going to be talking about nationally are what the gender gaps look like. So, people were expecting a record gender gap. That's not quite what the data is showing. It's interesting if we look at within group racial gender gaps. House. And so, for instance, amongst African American and Latino voters, we do actually see pronounced gender gaps. This is actually not different from what we saw in 2020. And so I think the reminder here, especially when you're having an historic first election like this, is that Republican women vote for Republican candidates. They don't vote for women candidates. So if a woman is not a member of their party, they're probably going to be pretty disinclined to vote for her. So I think that that's really going to be a big takeaway. Both candidates tried to reduce the margins in key places where they thought that their competitors were going to be strong. What it looks like here is that the Harris lose by less strategy didn't gain the traction that the Harris campaign would have hoped for it to gain. I think that that actually raises a good point. This doesn't change the story of demographic change in Georgia. Georgia is still changing demographically. Those demographic changes still privilege Democrats. And so you see it manifesting itself in certain contests. So you can look at some county level races, you can look at the county level vote, and you can see how new migrants, if you will, whether they're coming from across town or from across the country, are certainly changing the face of Georgia. This is an ongoing process. It's a process that's completely dynamic. And so, for Democrats, it just wasn't enough to be able to put Kamala Harris into the White House. Democrats are competitive in Georgia when the Republican candidate is particularly compromised and when they put a superior mobilization operation together. So Democrats did put a really strong mobilization operation together, but voters in the state didn't necessarily view President Trump as being as compromised in 2024 as he was in 2020. So I think dissatisfaction with COVID explains part of the reason why Joe Biden was able to win. And then also thinking about how well regarded President Trump is in the state. And we knew that kind of going in because he had high favorability ratings. And we also knew that nationally, people have more nostalgic memories of the Trump era. And so comparing that to what they were dissatisfied with the Biden administration was decisive.